All right, let's continue on with part two of this advanced landscape painting. This time we're only going to be focusing on the techniques used, so no art history or no background. If you want to watch that, make sure you check out the first part of this video. On the screen now is a completed painting, and in last week's video, we worked on that sky and those two mountains that are in the background where we used a scumble of opaque white to push them back into that background. And in today's video, we're going to be working on this rocky cliff on the left side of the painting, along with the water, erasing out some highlights in it, and we're going to start some of the foreground. The color mixtures for the mountain are also in last week's video, so make sure you check that one out. Links for it will be down below. The first thing we need to finish is the lower part of this mountain in the background. Now this is still pretty far away, but there's a fair amount of textures in here which we're going to use to make it look like there's some trees growing there in between those rocky structures that we see. Before we start this, I want to say thank you so much to Alex, who subscribed as a tier 3 member this last week. That's extremely generous of you, Alex, so thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I want to say thank you so much to Perry, who donated $50 from last week's video. To me, this is beyond generous and absurdly nice, so thank you so much, Perry. And I want you guys to know that these donations are going right back into this channel so that we could do some bigger and some cooler things in the future. So the first thing I want to do for this area is add some value into it using the mountain color that we mixed in last week's video and start adding some texture into it. And I'm just doing this freehand, kind of bouncing the airbrush around. When I bounce it around like this, I'm basically pulling back and pushing forward on the trigger over and over, getting these small soft dots into that background. When you look at a texture like this up close, it looks kind of messy, a bit sloppy, but the point of it is when you look at the painting from a distance, this is going to look like shadows and highlights, and that texture is going to basically look like some trees and some shrubbery, in that background there. It's essentially an illusion that we're painting to make it look like there's a lot more going on, when in reality, it's just a bunch of smaller soft dots sprayed next to each other. I want you to take a look on my completed painting on the left side of the screen of this area right here. To break up this texture in the trees, we're going to add some cliffs here, just like Bierstadt did in his original painting. So the first thing I did was just lay in some color there so we have some shadows, and I just did this freehand as you saw before, just to get that color down there. Now to start defining these, I'm using a Dremel here which has a sand eraser in it, and this is just basically an electric eraser. Any electric eraser will work just fine for this. And all I'm doing is just tapping this electric eraser down to the right side of each one of these shadows to pull out some highlights. Again, this is just an illusion that we're creating. We're adding some bright areas on the right and some shadows over to the left. And then when you look at this from a distance, it's going to look like some cliffs really far away in the distance. If you remember from last week's lesson, the light source on this painting is shining from right to left. So all that means is that every highlight is going to be on the right side of a rock or a cliff, and the shadow is going to be off to the left. And you'll see as I continue in this area, I'm just going to place a few of these around, some lower, some higher, and it's just going to be that same thing over and over. Shadows to the left, highlights to the right. And a good thing to try to do is try to change the size or shape of the shadows so everything doesn't look too linear or lined up. Maybe paint some shadows wider, some a little taller. This way you get some variety in there and it looks like some randomness going on. It doesn't look too sterile. And in between these rocks, I'll just switch off between my eraser and airbrush, pulling out and scratching out some highlights, kind of messy, and then just adding in some more values with that airbrush. With this small cliff here, I'm doing the exact same thing, just painting it freehand, getting in that dark, almost like 90-degree angle there, and then switching over to the eraser and just tapping in some of those highlights. Remember that when you're using an electric eraser, your highlights are going to pull out too bright. They're going to come out basically pure white. So you'll see that as I switch back to the airbrush to paint in some other areas, I just lightly spray some of that color over the area that I just erased out. That way it just darkens it up a little bit more, makes it look more natural. If you're painting this one along with me and you're working on this area here, one thing that I suggest to do is try not to think of these as mountains or cliffs. Just look at them and see where you see highlights and shadows and do the best you can using your airbrush and your eraser to replicate them. When you focus on shadows and highlights, you're painting things the way you see them rather than the way that you think they're supposed to look. And what will happen if those shadows and highlights are in the right area, as you stand back from the painting, you're going to see rocks and cliffs. And make no mistake about it, this is definitely a tricky thing to learn, especially in the beginning, to paint things the way you see them rather than the way you think they should look. Even after all these years of painting, I still struggle with this, and it's something that I actively have to fight and really pay attention to what I see. But the good news is that the more you paint, the better you get at this. If you're new to painting, you may not notice the mistakes that I made in this, but trust me, as I'm watching this video and I look at my completed painting, I definitely see them. And I think that some of the best painters that ever lived just got very good at concealing or hiding their mistakes, making them less noticeable. So as you improve your technique, you're still making mistakes, but you're just making better mistakes, if that makes sense. So now that we have this area painted in, what we're going to do is switch over to some opaque white, and we're going to spray this right over the top like we did for this mountain. I'm spraying this directly out of the bottle, spraying it 20 psi, and when I lay this over the top, we're doing something called scumbling. And just to repeat what I said in last week's video, what a scumble is a light opaque color over a darker one. This is going to do two major things that we want. The first thing is that it's going to lower the contrast between the darks and the lights. When you spray a lighter color on, it's obviously going to lighten those dark areas, and the light areas are going to stay the same. So we're bringing the value up in those darker areas to give us less contrast. And the second major thing that happens is that light scumble is going to shift the color temperature to a cooler tone. This is going to help with that illusion of distance to make this mountain look far away, like it's pushed off into the background. You know, like there's an atmosphere between us and that mountain. When I use the white to add a scumble on, I try to spray it as evenly as possible in this area. So I hold it about 6 to 8 inches away and then just lightly dust it, spray it over that whole area. So let's move along to this cliff on the left side of the painting. The first thing I want to do is start with some Frisket film, because I want a very sharp edge along the outside of this. If you gridded this one out and drew these lines in with pencil, just follow your pencil lines to get a basic mountain shape here. You don't have to follow these exactly, and I'll show you why as we start painting this. I'm switching back to that brownish color that we mixed for the mountain in the first part of this video, and I just want to spray this along the outside where the Frisket meets the sky. I'm not really concerned with filling in this whole left side of the canvas with paint just yet. You'll see I'll use a shield to paint in some shadows here, but I'm mainly focusing along that edge so that I get that sharp line for this mountain. When I paint with Frisket, I generally want to paint with it as quick as possible and get it off, because if you leave it on too long and keep painting, your lines are just way too sharp and they don't look natural. This is also one of the reasons why I don't like printing out a picture and then cutting out pieces of it to use as a stencil. Of course, there's nothing wrong with painting like that. Everyone's going to have their own style, their own technique. But to me, it just looks like a stencil painting if you paint the whole thing using cutouts. That's why in all my videos, I always recommend starting with a pencil drawing, just some basic graphite contour lines, and then using shields and masks to get those sharp lines. But I also come from a pretty strong drawing background, so for me, any painting always starts with graphite. Again, it's just my preference. So after I've removed the Frisket, I'm just going to paint in freehand here and lightly spray this mountain color over the left side of this, just so I have some paint in there, so I have something to work with. We're going to be using a lot of erasing and scratching techniques here, so obviously in order to erase, we need some paint down. As I said earlier, the light source, which is the sun, is shining from right to left, so all shadows are going to be on the left side. So I'm taking a ripped piece of paper here and spraying directly along the edge of it because I want this line to be very sharp. I'm not bouncing this color off the paper like I would on a portrait. I'm spraying directly on it to give me a very sharp line. And the reason that I'm putting in a few of these shadows is that it's going to help guide me, because I know that the highlights are going to be off to the right of each one of these. So as I put down a shadow, I know that I'm going to switch over to my eraser next and erase out a highlight to the right. Now take a look over here on the left side of the screen on my completed painting. We can see that this area here is in shadow, but within that shadow are some textures, which are some highlights and then some deeper, darker shadows. Since I want a few different textures within that shadow, you'll see here that I switch off between using that ripped piece of paper and then just painting in freehand to get some softer lines. So with some of these smaller shadows placed in, we're going to have to add highlights to them, because every highlight is always going to have a shadow, and every shadow is always going to have a corresponding highlight. Now this smaller section of highlights and shadows are in what we call a cast shadow, because the mountain is casting a shadow on that side of the cliff. So within this cast shadow to pull out highlights, I'm using a stick eraser because I don't want them too bright. The reason I love using this is because that I can control how much paint I pull out just by the pressure that I use. This is one of the reasons that I love painting on gesso, whether it's gessoed paper or gessoed canvas like I'm using here. You just get way more control in your erasing. It's not all or nothing like some other synthetic papers out there. So you can see that as I'm erasing here, I'm just pulling these out in vertical strokes up and down, and I'm just trying to follow the angle of the mountain. It kind of curves from right up to left, and I'm doing the best I can to keep these lines relatively parallel to each other. Once I have some areas erased out, I switch right back over to the airbrush with the mountain color that we mixed, and I'm spraying this in to darken the shadows. And also while I'm doing that, I'm also letting some of that paint get on the area that I erased, so it kind of darkens it up a little bit more, makes it look a little bit more natural. Now, what I'm doing right here is what I'm going to do for this whole mountain. I'm going to start with some ripped pieces of paper to first add in a few shadows. And again, this isn't like a portrait where we want some soft transitions. We want these very sharp and defined. So I'm spraying right along the edge of the piece of paper. So where the paper meets the canvas, I'm spraying a good amount of paint so I get a very sharp line there. I know this looks strange right now and it doesn't look natural, but what we're going to have to do is add highlights over to the right of all of these shadows, and I'm basically going to place these across this whole rocky cliff on the left side of the painting. Now this tool, which is the electric eraser, is going to be the easiest way to add in a lot of textures very quickly. I'm using a Dremel here, which is retrofitted to fit a sand eraser, but I really don't recommend these. It's very annoying to replace the eraser inside when it wears out. So I'm going to have a link down below to one that I really like that I bought recently. It works just as well. And the way I'm using the electric eraser is I'm just lightly touching the surface of the canvas. That way it's pulling out some paint, but it's not pulling out all of it. It's kind of erasing in a bit of a messy way. What I mean by messy is that it's not pulling out a straight line wherever I press down on it, because I'm not fully pressing it into the canvas. It's pulling off little bits of paint here and there, and it just kind of adds a unique texture. It's not perfect, but to me, this kind of looks like a rock texture. It looks like a bunch of different bumps and stuff. And what's nice about it is this is really, really easy to do. You know, I'm just letting the eraser do most of the work. The only thing I'm trying not to do is not press too hard on it because I don't want it to erase all the paint. Another tool that I like to use is one of these aggressive sand erasers, which I fit into a clutch pencil. This type of eraser is pretty unique because it's in between a ink eraser, which is that stick eraser, and an electric one. So it's pretty aggressive, but it's also dependent on how much pressure I use. So if I press really hard on it, it's going to pull out more paint. And if I use less pressure, it's going to pull out less paint. But what I like to do is cut a chiseled edge on it. So if I press really hard on it, it pulls out a lot more paint than a standard ink eraser. Once those textures are erased out, I switch right back to the airbrush and I start darkening in some of these values. You're going to see here, I'm just freehand painting, adding some darker values to the shadow, which is off to the right of these highlights, and also these darker ones that are just to the left of the highlights. While I'm doing that, I'm also allowing some of the overspray to get on that erased area. That's going to make those highlights look a little bit more natural. They're not going to be too bright. And this procedure is what I'm going to do across the whole face of this cliff. Now I'm going to speed this up so that this video isn't too long, but if you're painting along with me, just try to look at my reference and try to notice where you see some of those dark shadows, which are vertical, going up and down. I'm always experimenting with painting, so you'll see here I used that skin texture template that I used in some other videos to try to add some texture in. Honestly, it's not worth it, so I don't recommend using it. The key here, though, to getting this in effectively and pretty easily is just start with those dark shadows like I did here. You could either paint them in freehand or use a ripped piece of paper. It's really up to you. And then just switch over to the eraser and pull out highlights to the right of them. This isn't difficult to do, but it's definitely time consuming. It's slow because you have to really pay attention to the reference, try to see where you see those highlights, and then constantly switch off between your eraser and your airbrush. And something you'll see me do over and over is constantly erase, then add more paint and erase again. This way you're layering the textures on top of each other. So once a first area is erased out and that glaze is sprayed over the top, that second layer that I pull out is going to be brighter. So it's going to make it look like there's some depth there. Within those highlights, you can have some lighter versions of highlights and some brighter, more specular highlights within it. I'm only using about 2 or 3 layers of erasing, paint, erase again. But, you know, if you really want to get a lot of texture in here, you could just keep doing this over and over to make it look incredibly realistic. For me, this is basically good enough. Again, these textures aren't perfect, but this amount of work isn't monotonous, so it doesn't take too long. From here, I'm going to switch over to using the airbrush freehand, and I'm just going to add some shadows within those highlights, again, to make it look a little bit more natural. And I'm also going to work along this edge here, adding some little lines up to make it look like some trees are growing there. And that helps break up that very sharp line that we got using the Frisket. Again, it really doesn't matter what you add there. You're just kind of spraying some little dots, some little lines along the edge, just anything so that line isn't too sharp. If you're wondering what that paper towel is under my hand, that's just something to protect my hand from resting on the canvas itself. I noticed Createx Illustration Colors is very sensitive to moisture, so if any sweat from your hand gets on that, it could start lifting up the paint, especially if it hasn't fully cured yet. So it's a good idea to use, maybe a piece of paper or a paper towel, just something so you're not touching the paint. So let's go through this again for the lower part of this mountain using those exact same techniques. Within the airbrush right now, I'm just using that ripped piece of paper and trying to spray shadows all over here. You can see above some of these sharper ones, I just sprayed some dots in there. That's going to give me something so that when I erase into it, it looks like there's some other textures there, that it's not just pure white. From here, same thing, switch over to that eraser and start tapping out highlights just to the right of the shadows. Again, when I'm using the electric eraser, I'm not pressing too hard on it. I can't stress that enough. You just want to lightly touch it to the canvas. These erasers are very aggressive. And when you lightly touch it like that, it's not going to pull out all the paint. It's going to give you a texture that looks like this. From there, spray a light layer of that paint over the top, and that's called the glaze, and then erase into it again. The more layers you add, the more realistic and natural your texture is going to be. And for the right side of this mountain, I just added a whole bunch of these shadows in first. That way I know the shadow is going to be here and the highlight is going to be off to the right of each one of these. So it's really up to you as the painter to decide how you want to go about painting this. If you want to just start by adding all the shadows in on this cliff first, that's fine. And then, you have them mapped out and then switch over to the eraser for the highlights. But for me personally, I generally like working on one small section and then moving over to the next, usually working from left to right. If you look at my completed painting on the left, you'll see that I added some darker values right in the middle of this mountain here. And the reason for that is to make it look like a cloud is casting a shadow over that. So you see we have this brighter highlight above it and then a brighter one down below. And to darken this area, all you need to do is spray a thin layer of that mountain color over this whole area. It's very easy to do, and that transparent layer is called a glaze. And a glaze is the opposite of a scumble. A scumble is spraying a lighter opaque color over the existing layers to lighten it up. And remember, that's what we did with the mountain in the background. And a glaze is spraying a transparent color over the original painting to darken it. So now let's move on to the final part of this week's lesson. What we're going to do here is paint the water, which is essentially a reflection of the mountains. But before we get into that, I'm going to start painting a few of these rocks here, which are in the foreground of this landscape. Just like everything else, the shadows are going to be on the left side of each rock and the highlights are off to the right. So you can see that I used a ripped piece of paper just to spray in the lines at the bottom and the left side of it to get this shadow marked in. And there's going to be a bunch of rocks down here at the bottom, and we're just going to follow that same procedure of using that ripped piece of paper to spray in very lightly the lines along the bottom of it, and then just darken up the left side either using a shield or just painting it in freehand. And to keep this simple, I'm just using that same mountain color that we used for the rest of the painting so far. Now we'll continue adding some more of these rocks in later, but what I want to do now is with that same color, that mountain color in the airbrush, we're going to start painting in the water. This part is pretty easy. You're really going to let the airbrush do most of the work. When you paint water that's completely flat like this lake, it basically acts like a large mirror, and it's going to reflect everything behind it in the background. So that includes the mountains and the sky. So the way I'm going about this is basically just copying what I see from that mountain that I painted before and then replicating it down below. But this time I'm letting the airbrush do most of the work. I'm not going to add much texture to this. I want to try to keep it soft and smooth. I painted those rocks in the foreground to show you that you could paint right over them when you're doing this. You'll see later that we'll pull out some highlights on those, so it doesn't matter if you spray right over the top of them. It's not like you need to mask them or anything like that. The most important thing to do here is pay attention to the mountain that you painted before, because what you're doing here is you're painting the reflection of it. So to get an accurate looking reflection, it has to be the same thing, but in reverse. And this is what I meant by letting the airbrush do most of the work here. I'm not using shields here. You can see I'm just painting this freehand, trying to copy what I see. And the airbrush is naturally going to soften these up to make it look like a soft reflection in that water. And for me, this is one of the great advantages of using an airbrush, because I used to paint landscapes all the time in oil like 15 years ago or so. Before switching over to an airbrush. And with those, the water's a lot of work because you have to add the paint in and you have to blend it with small brushes. Here, I can get water done in, 10, 15 minutes. But granted, if it's easy water, kind of like this is not much going on there. There's not many ripples in it. We're going to add a bit, but it's basically just a reflection. So what I want to do here is add in a highlight all along this line that separates the water from that background. This is going to make it look like there's some motion in the water, maybe some small waves kind of brushing up against the shore, and it's going to help separate the water from that background. So the way I'm going about doing this is using an ink eraser. This is one of the Staedtler ones. And I'm just erasing out a horizontal line on that border. It's very important that you erase this line out completely horizontal. You don't want any angles in it or any diagonals. Again, I'm not a huge fan of rules in painting, but another thing in landscape painting is that any sort of waves or ripples in the water are always going to be horizontal and parallel to the horizon line. Unless you're painting a seascape that has a lot of waves in it, water is always going to be flat, and those ripples and lines in the water are always going to be horizontal. And for the right side of the water here, I'm doing the same thing, just following what I see and trying to copy it. You'll see that I used a shield here for some areas to paint in some sharper reflections. I actually don't recommend doing that. I was just trying it to see what it looks like. I recommend just painting in freehand for this whole section. And once that paint is on, let it dry for a few seconds and then erase into it. Just get that horizontal line out, which separates the water from the background. So this is where we're going to wrap up the second part of this lesson. And next week, which is the final one, we're going to finish painting this foreground. So thank you guys so much for watching. And again, thank you Perry, Alex, Jeremy, Dwayne, M. Shibley, and Andrew. Your generous support is greatly appreciated. So take care everyone, be well, and I'll see you back here next Friday.